to cover okay? All right, so I guess it's just gonna be you, Chloe, and your cousin. So hi, welcome, guys. Um, First off and foremost, just want to make sure you can hear me okay. Okay, perfect. So, today we are going to cover six new different Zentangle designs. We're also going to be talking a little bit about light source and shading as well, and what that kind of contributes to our Zentangle patterns here. Okay. I'm just going to leave my camera open because this is how I'm going to work it for today. If you have any questions, as always, please type it in the chat. Or you can just hop on the mic. Feel free to interrupt me or anything like that if I can't see it. So to start with, we're going to be learning about the overlapping designs to create depth as well as the shading. To start with, we'll do the overlapping designs here. So some patterns will naturally lend themselves to creating depth, especially when a pattern is overlapping and repeating until the area of the string within our Zentangle is full. This gives the impression that the pattern is receding away. So please refer to the diagram below, and that's these three right here. To create this effect, what I ended up doing is I ended up drawing a tangle once, which you can see in box one. Think of this pattern as now being opaque, such as nothing should really show through it at all. It's solid, just like this pen. If I cover any of the writing that I have, you cannot see the writing underneath. Repeat the pattern, but lift the pen off the paper when you come to the first drawn pattern, which you can see right here in box number 2. As you saw, I ended up drawing a couple different patterns right here, and then I just drew a circle and I made sure that I lifted it. So this main pattern right here stays up front. Okay. And you'll continue this pattern with the pen until you reach the other side. Then you can see that the pattern starts to form, especially in box 3 as we start to repeat it. So here I do not have any patterns really kind of overlap or showing that they are going through each other. They are overlapping in some way, shape, or form. Okay. And a lot of the times, drawing tangles that are overlapping one another tend to, using this approach can be a way to intermingle two different tangles together. And this has been historically seen in Zentangles since it started. So this is definitely a pattern or a type of way of designing patterns that you can continue moving forward. And you could do this with a lot of different tangles altogether. The other thing you can do to kind of make your tangles a little more interesting is by enhancing yours in tangles. So some enhancements, we call them tangle enhancers, add interest for the eye, and each one has aspects that make them as a handy tool. Zentangles has tends to have 6 tangle enhancers, such as auroras, dewdrops, perfs, rounding, shading, and sparkles. Shading is one of those enhancers that we do tend to use in all of our patterns to create depth, dimension, and form. On patterns that obtain orbs, such as the poke root, which is what we're going to learn about here, um, they can help create a three-dimensional effect. So for instance, if I wanted to make, a circle into a sphere going from a 2D shape to a 3D shape, I would want to add some type of shading. I actually have a little bit of a sample of this. So let me find that page here just to kind of show you guys. So for instance, here I have these three boxes, right? Or rectangles. By adding shading, I can start by making it feel like it has two sides, that it is round, and then just by adding shading, I can make it into a 3D shape. So that's what I mean by adding shading to a lot of your work. For instance, if you look at this guy here, in reality, it's just a pattern. That's all it is. And then I added shading on the bottom, which is making it feel more like a tube kind of shape. Okay. Let me see if I have any other examples. For instance, here I have that shading going on in this pattern as well. Okay, so enhancers are one of those things that you can utilize for all of your tangle designs. And we did talk a little bit about that. If you remember from last time, we were talking a little bit about shading and how it kind of feels overlapping a little bit, and making it kind of pop out more. So tangle patterns are not meant to look like anything, but then again, sometimes they end up looking like something, right? So as you become more familiar with new patterns each day, please, as we move through, take note of the examples of shading in the final diagram box of each pattern as we go through them. They will contain tips for shading the pattern throughout the rest of our lessons and beyond. So if you end up coming back next time for Zentangle Method 2, 3, or 4, we'll definitely be adding more and more and more on top of that. Now, the one thing I did want to show you is I wanted to show you a different type of enhancer as well. And this comes from this Zentangle book that I use as well. So with this one, you can actually see right here. So this person here, she ended up drawing her box with the 4 dots and everything and had the string go through and everything like that. But what she ended up doing is she didn't take the pattern all the way to all 4 corners of her square. She ended up stopping it and making it a little more interesting. And sometimes this particular method is really interesting. And I'm sure you saw it on one of my other patterns that I just showed you previously. It wasn't a full square, it wasn't anything like that. So feel free to start experimenting with that kind of thing as well. You don't have, again, you don't have to take it all the way to the edge. You can take it up to a certain point. And then if you end up erasing these lines, it'll end up popping out and making a kind of an interesting sort of shape altogether on your tile. So that is something else that I would encourage you to do. So to start with, we're going to work on the poke root to start with, which is basically this pattern right here. So to start, we're going to make um, one kind of little mushroom symbol. So what we're going to do is we're going to draw, and I'm going to angle it here. We're going to draw 2 lines kind of popping up wherever you want to start it. If you want to start it in a different direction, that's fine. Then you would just do a curve, and then you would do a circle. Then, and let me just repeat this and have it a little smaller. What you would do after that is you would just start layering it from here. So for instance, and I'm going to do this in a different color. And remember, don't forget to lift your pen because you want that overlapping to occur. So here I have one. I could do another one right here and have it go behind. I could do another one here popping up and over. And so on and so forth. in however way you want to make that design. So then what your tanker will look like, and I'm going to just create it here. So keep practicing while I do this. Because I wanted to show you the shading of this next. So once you have your pattern, this is where you would add shading. So for instance, with this particular pattern, the best type of shading is kind of like right inside it. And what shading will do is it'll actually add more of like a 3D kind of form to it. Now, variant to this, because remember we were talking about different forms and different variations of the pattern. Like last time we were looking at a couple different variations of, I think, the footstep pattern, or I can't remember what it was called off the top of my head. But one thing you can do with this particular pattern is you can leave the background white, or you can fill it in. So I want to show you what that looks like when it's filled in. And I'm only going to do about half of it just to show you. So sometimes you can do a different variation um, of the pattern and it ends up being something interesting, or it lends itself to a different type of design. And then you can also do a different variant of a pattern where it doesn't have a lot of space at all. You could fill it up with this poke root type pattern. And that way there's no really background space or anything like that. So here you can kind of see the difference of what it looks like with a black background versus a white and clear background. Any questions on the poke root? Okay, perfect. So the next one we're going to look at is going to be festoon. So Festoune. Believe me, this pattern is literally called that. You can Google it if you want to. And these names are all different types of tangle patterns. So to start with, we're going to start by doing 4 ovals. Place them wherever, doesn't matter, and make sure you color them in. And they're tiny. They're not very big. So here I'm just going to repeat the same ones here as best as I can because I can't do copy and paste on actual paper. And if you're following along and you do have these squares and everything, feel free to fill that out if that's how you want to do it, so you can have the steps being shown. So this would be like step 1, and it would go down. So this is the same. So I am going to do the next step with my pink pen here. And what I am going to do is I'm going to draw 4 circles around the ovals that we just created. So I'm going to draw a circle here. And it doesn't need to be even or anything like that. Um, let's do this one. So I'm going to try and have the same sort of shape for each one. And if you're working on a separate pattern, that's perfectly fine too. But these are some fun patterns to kind of practice and add into your daily tangles that you create. Once you have your circle, then we're going to start by adding these sort of like curly cues to it. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to follow along and color. And I'm going to do that for each one. You can, it's almost like a spider, like spider legs, if you want to think of it that way. Since it's close to Halloween, we can call it spider legs. But don't forget, when it comes to like the side or the edge of your pattern, it does stop. You don't need to do the whole thing unless it's coming outside of the square, in which case then you would. And you could do them however condensed if you want or anything like that. So if you just want a couple of them, that's perfectly fine. And here you can see I actually changed the direction of how it pops out to kind of follow the curve of the circle. And this is another thing that you could do. This is a nice drawing style to help kind of make it feel a little more 3D. So I'm going to do that with the other ones here, and then I'll show you guys what you can do to fill up the spaces. So then the next step, once you have those in, then you're going to fill in the other spaces with smaller ones. So basically you can kind of choose wherever you want to put them. So I'm going to put a dot here and make an oval. We'll put a dot here with an oval. And don't forget, you can have them overlap as well because we are working on overlapping. And then again, you can add those curly cues to it or those little spider legs. So then it ends up looking sort of like maybe even almost like a pumpkin. I don't know. I'm starting to see like a pumpkin pattern happening. Maybe because I'm just in the mood, because it's almost Halloween and I love Halloween. Halloween's the best time of year. Not because of the pumpkins or anything, but because you get to dress up and get creative with all of your Halloween decorations. And then what you can do as well as a variation is you can color in the background if you want, just to kind of show you what it looks like. And then, of course, the last step would be adding shading just to make it feel a little more 3D. So, with an oval shape, typically you want to kind of figure out where your light source is going to be. What I mean by light source is, for instance, if I take my pencil sharpener here, okay, and I put it on the top, and I have it right here, where do you think the light source is shining? Is it shining up? Is it shining to the left, the right, or down below? It's coming from above, right? It's coming up this way. What if I moved it all of a sudden? Now, which direction is that light source coming from? Not quite from the left, because this is the left side, right? So it is yep, it is the right. So this is the right side. If I had it on the left side, as you can see, that means this side would be bright, right? And then this side would have the shadow. And then if I had it directly on top, and as you guys can see, this is going to kind of throw it off just a little bit. But if I had it directly on top, there's barely any shadow, right? Yeah, it is a little bit inverted. You might see the logo say or have the logo on the bottom be backwards. That's okay though. I don't know why it's inverted. For some reason, my camera is just like that. I don't understand why. So that's the light source. Okay. So that's the direction and where the light is coming from. So you want to figure out what direction you want your light to come from, especially when it comes to these ovals, circles, anything like that. So what I'm going to determine, and what I like to do is I like to draw a little sun to remind me on where my light source is going to come from. So for me, I think I'm going to have it up top. So I'm just going to draw a little sun with my pencil to indicate that it's coming from the top for me. Okay. And then that's when you start to shade the opposite direction. So if it's coming from the top, then the bottom part of your oval or circle or whichever is going to be shaded. Now, if it's overlapping, you know that a lot of the times when things overlap, some of it is covered in shadow and some of it still has some highlights. Some of it is all covered in shadow. So it just depends. Play around with your shadows a little bit if you want to experiment. So this is roughly what my shading would look like. And now I feel like it's popping out just a little bit. And then, of course, as I said, with your pencils and things, you can add definitely go a little darker if you want to. Take your eraser, erase it a little bit if you want to. Anything like that to kind of make it pop a little bit. Any questions on this pattern, the festoon pattern? Okay. Is your cousin okay too? 'Cause I know I'm assuming they're watching. Okay. So the last one here is called Hollenbach. And what that is basically the pattern that I kind of drew last week with the lines and overlapping. So to start with, and I'm going to start with my black, is I'm going to just pick a direction, any direction. Um, I'm going to go from the left side to the right diagonally, and that's going to be my first line. And I'm going to do this for every single one. And it is going to change just a little bit for each square because not every square is the same. And again, the steps go down. So then the next step is I am going to draw a different one below it. So don't forget to pick up your pen when you draw this. And I'm going to do a couple more on this one. And then we'll just do another one here. And then what I would want you guys to do is just continue filling the page with these lines. And don't forget to lift up your pen or pencil so that you can have it overlap. So again, the pattern's not going to be exactly the same as what I just drew on the very top part, but we can get the gist of it at least. And then with this one, you'll add more behind it. So I'm going to actually make my lines a little smaller too. You can make them wide, you can make them small, you can make them go up and down, side to side, whatever you want to do. It's going to be a lot of overlapping, so make sure you are paying attention to where your line is overlapping. And again, as you draw this, don't forget to breathe. Breathing is an essential thing here when we draw. Now, once we have our pattern the way we want it, you color the background. So you're probably sitting there and thinking, well, Miss S, I'm not really sure where my background is anymore because I have too many lines. This is where you kind of determine it and you're like, okay, so here I have my lines. I know this was part of my lines here. So I know that that's part of my background. And if that's part of my background, then this should be part, then this should be part, and it starts to kind of fill in on where everything needs to be colored in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch my marker to my Sharpie just to make it color a little bit more quickly. And don't stress if you end up, coloring in the wrong square or wrong space or anything like that. It's okay. This is why you practice these patterns a couple times and then you create a tangle with it. So then there's my background. And you can see how it starts to pop up a little bit too. So I'm going to color the same thing on this side too. So again, make sure it's nice and solid. And if you make a mistake and you want to correct it, and you can, let's say you're using a pencil or something, try to erase it and then go back. Otherwise, it's okay. Because that's the one main rule about Zentangles is that there are no mistakes. We can turn things into other things. And then the last step is dealing with shading. So with this, shading helps us kind of see where the overlapping occurs. So I'm going to move my piece up here a little bit. So we know just based off of our pattern, our series of patterns, that this top part is overlapping all of the ones underneath it. So that means the ones underneath it need to have the shading. So you'll have shading here, you'll put a little bit of shading here, and then you'll put some shading here, right? And then you'll also have a little bit of shading here and a little shading there. And then you can basically go from there. So this one, the one that's diagonal this way, will have shading for the ones that are underneath it. Again, darker as it gets close to the line, lighter as it goes away. Remember, we were talking about the gradients and the shading. It's just like that. And then you do the same thing. And then eventually it starts to work itself out. And you should start to see your pattern really pop out. Again, you can take your finger if you want and blend a little, whatever you want to do. And you could do this with colored pencil if you want as well, adding shading to the value that you have with your colored pencil. You could also do it that way. Any questions on this pattern? Okay, perfect. So then we'll go ahead and move on to the next thing. So hopefully you can read this correctly because at least on my screen it's showing it the correct orientation where it says orb or hole, right? You can read that. I just want to make sure you can read it. It's not backwards for you. It is backwards for you? Huh. That is strange because I don't see it backwards. I was wondering about that. Let me try this. Uh, nope. Is that better? Is that oriented correctly? Huh. That's really interesting. All right. Well, either way, we'll just go with it from this point forward. It's going to look backwards on my screen, so I do apologize. That's really strange. Okay. So, orb or hole, only shading will tell. Okay. So, even though um we are creating abstract pieces of art. As I said before, shading is still a very important part of the art piece. Shading helps draw us in. It helps move the eye across the piece. It also helps and makes dips, curves, edges, and angles in our artwork feel believable. It can help to be used to add atmosphere or weight to a drawing or painting, as well as tonal contrast, and it can make an unrecognizable world seem familiar and inviting. While shading, pick an area to use as a light source. And remember, we just talked about this. If the light is coming from a certain direction, the shadow will fall on the opposite direction. So, for instance, I have two different tangles here. I have one here and two here. So for number one, where do you think the light source is coming from this pattern? Is it coming from the top right, the top left, the very top, uh, the far left, the far right, corners of the bottom, or the very bottom? Where do you think this shadow, or I'm sorry, not the shadow, the light source is coming from? Top left or left? You are correct. So if I had to draw my little sun somewhere to help indicate to me where it needs to go, it would be right about here. That's what I had in mind when I made this. What about this one though? Where's the light source now? The right side? Yeah, exactly. It would be the right side. It actually, funny enough, it would actually be a little bit more towards the bottom. The reason I say that is because this guy right here, I kind of indicated that by adding a little shadow around it. See that? So since it's coming from the bottom, it kind of casts a little bit of a longer shadow. If we look at this, okay, I have my pencil and I decide to take my light source to this basically the table's edge. Okay. And I don't want to blind the camera here, so I do apologize. If I take my light source to the very edge, you can see that the shadow here gets longer and darker, right? Compared to if it's above. See how the shadow changes just from going above to almost being even? So it also depends on the light source and where it's coming from. If it's really top, it's kind of more angled down. Whereas if it's coming from the side, it's more even with the shape. And it's really fun. If you have, like a flashlight, if you want to use your phone, if you have a phone that has a flashlight attached to it, take it to any uh, shape of any kind. I mean, I could use my eraser here, just have it sideways. You can see how the shadows change depending on the direction of the light source. So feel free to play around with that. It's a lot of fun, and this is definitely a learning tool that you could use for any of your drawings, not just in tangles. So for this particular one, I would say the light source is definitely to the right, but it's also a little bit more towards the bottom. So it's kind of like a bottom right. And that's where my light source would be. Do you guys feel confident about the light source? Do you want to see another example? Have any questions on that? Anything like that? That's okay if you haven't been using shading, but I would definitely want you to start using a little bit of it with your patterns because sometimes it'll actually help your patterns pop out a little more. Feel free to play around with it if you wanted to create the same tangle or the same pattern that you created before and you didn't want to mess it up. Feel free to create a copy of it and then play around with the shadows. Sometimes you might surprise yourself and you'll be like, "Oh, this way that the shadows are working is really, really cool." But shadows just tend to give us a little bit more of kind of like an exciting um, aspect to our artwork. And it helps, like I said, move the eye and it helps us really kind of determine the shade or the shapes and what we're using in each area and that kind of thing. So moving on, we're going to try and get through at least two or three more patterns here. So the first one we're going to work on next is going to be the Shattuck. Shattuck. And to start, we're going to draw a string of an oval kind of shape, just anywhere, and then a series of three kind of bolded lines and have them kind of curve in a little bit. So I'm going to do the same thing for these. So then the next step is that we're going to add these sort of triangle patterns that look like this with lines that echo it. So to start with, and this may seem a little confusing at first, I'm going to draw a line and then I'm going to draw another triangle line and then another triangle line. And I'm going to do the same thing for each row. So start with a line, triangle that touches the top, goes back to the bottom, top to bottom. And notice that the line isn't starting from this point, it's starting from the actual triangle. So it's almost like you're drawing like a right triangle almost, if that makes sense. And then you want to fill them in. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to fill them in based off of this line right here. That's the far left line. So I'm just going to do a couple lines. It doesn't need to be a lot of them. Obviously, you can make them very skinny, close together to very wide apart. It just depends on the pattern that you want to create. But just keep in mind you're not coloring it in. Now the last step, and I'm going to do this in a different color because it's going to take me a while to fill this out. So I'm going to do a dark blue here, is to do the opposite direction. So what I mean by that is you see how your lines are going this way? This time, because it's coming to each of the lines here, you're going to do the opposite direction. So I'm going to do this direction instead for my opposite lines. So it ends up almost feeling like it is wrapping itself around each other. So here, let me lift my pen once I fill this in so you can see the difference. Because I know my hand's probably blocking it. Let me just kind of zoom in here. So you can kind of see how it's wrapping itself a little bit. Once you have that, then of course the shading occurs. And since this is more of a curved line, I would probably do the shading here just to kind of start with and around. And then maybe not as, and then you can even add a little bit of shadow if you want these lines to pop out. I know it's a little hard to see with the pen, but and that is this pattern. Do you guys need to see another example, anything like that with this one? Yes? Okay. So again, we're going to start, and I'll do this in black this time so you guys can see. So you see how it's connecting, or it's not connecting to the bottom here, it's connecting to the triangle. So I'm sure this part probably makes sense, right? And it's okay if we don't get to all of these patterns today. And then, like I said, I'm going to follow this here, right? And then in the opposite direction, you would fill it the other way. So I'm going from, instead of going from, let's say, right to left, I'm doing left to right. And here, let me see if I can't zoom in just a little. And then again, with the shading, since it's a sphere, I'm going to worry not so much, but I'm going to at least do the edges as well as around the inside. And then with these lines, these solid white lines now that don't have the pattern, I'm going to put my shadow below them. So it kind of gives it a little more of like a 3D, like it's wrapping itself around the sphere that has the pattern. Hopefully you can see it a little bit better now. Yeah, so it's kind of like this. If you want to think of it this way, I'm just going to kind of move this down. So it's like you're doing this pattern, right? And you're following along with this. Let's say you have a top, right? And then you're going to do the opposite direction. So it's almost like you're wrapping something around. If you've ever seen like mummies with wraps, you're doing overlapping. if you know what I mean. Or like, I don't know if you read anime or manga or anything like that, but sometimes like with samurai, they wrap their sword sheath with it or anything like that. It's kind of like you're wrapping it, except it's in this particular pattern. And then the shading goes around it. It's a little hard, but like I said, if you practice it a couple times, you will start to get it. Do you want to see it one more time, or are we good with that? Okay. So we are at 6:52. I did want to touch base with you guys. Are you guys good for one more, or do you need to leave? Since you're the only two in here. I just want to make sure if we can squeeze one more in, that's perfect. If not, okay, cool. So let me zoom out again. Whoop. There we go. And we'll do, whoops, if I can figure it out. There we go. We'll do NIPA, N-I-P-A. That's the next pattern. Okay. So to start with this pattern, let me get my pen. We're going to draw a series of circles, however way you want to draw them, wherever you want them. Small, medium, large, doesn't matter. Cutting off the edge, a series of circles. And I'm going to do the same thing for all of my step squares here. Then the next step is sort of right in the middle, draw a wave of some kind. Any kind of wave. I'm going to do something like, and don't forget to lift up your pen if you're overlapping. And then what you're going to do is you're just going to fill in the wave following the same pattern towards the left. So here with my pen, this one I'm actually won't need to worry about lifting until I come to my circle. So make sure you lift your pen or pencil when you approach a circle. And then you'll do the same thing on the other side by going in the opposite direction. So I'm just going to do this really fast. So just bear with me. So it looks like this. You can make it go a little closer together if you want. You can make it further away. However way you want your wave to be represented. So you guys can see what it looks like. And it could be really close together. You could put lines in between. Yeah, it sort of looks like you said, yeah, with waves with rocks and things like that. Yeah, this is a very organic kind of pattern if you want to think of it like that. Organic meaning very natural. And then the last part is dealing with the shadows. So this is what I mean by when I say orb or hole. So you can either have these have a shadow like they're orbs floating on top of the waves, or you could have them with a shadow representing them being holes, like there's holes or rips in the waves. So I'm going to show you what the orbs look like on this one here, and then I'll show you what the shadows look like on this one. So if this is an orb, what you're going to do is you're just going almost like it's a sphere. Make sure you pick your light source and then color it in. And you'll have, not a lot of shadows or highlights to that. You can add a little bit darker by pressing on your paper a little bit harder as it gets closer to the edge. And then what you can do is you can even have shading behind it. So for instance, here and here, you can see that this is more of like an orb popping out. And again, I know it's a little, yeah, it's pretty much an optical illusion pattern. Yeah, for sure. Now with the other one, if you wanted to make it feel like it's holes and the waves are on top and there's space down below, you would do the same kind of shading, but this time you wouldn't make it as extreme. So you would have it a little bit darker along the edge, wherever your light source would be. And this would actually even have it a little more here. And that's it. You wouldn't add any other shading to it. So this is where that question is it an orb or is it a shadow based off of the shading that we do? Notice that within this wave pattern, I do not have any shading on top of it. I'm leaving it as is. Whereas with this one, I do have some shading like right in here. And same with here. It's on the outside of the orb. So you can do the pattern two different ways. Okay. And then before I let you go, because I know that was a little rushed, I did want to show you this book's example of that pattern. So you can see how they used the orb right here, how they used some of the patterns that we were looking at last time, the mushroom type pattern, the lines, and then the checkerboard here. So that's how they would use it in a Zentangle, just to give you an example. And since we are running out of time, we won't look at this last one here, but if you want to Google it, the way you spell it is Jonqual. It's basically the checkerboard pattern, but it's more of like a zigzag than a checkerboard, than like the straight up and down and cross. It's more of like a zigzag. Okay, before I let you go, any questions at all about any of the patterns that we went over today? Okay, perfect. So next time, as you do your tangles, try to incorporate these next few patterns that we just learned. When you get a chance, because I know you said you were making a new kind of pattern your own, feel free to send that to me by my email. You should hopefully have my email. If you don't, I can type it in the chat for you here very briefly before you leave. But I would love to see an example of your work, okay? And I will see you next Thursday. Thank you for stopping by. Hope you have a good rest of your week and weekend. Also, happy Halloween.